But you mentioned some of these, what I think people would refer to like maladaptive sort of conditions. You mentioned autism and you mentioned ADHD, and you think like evolutionarily, oh, how could that be valuable, right? I think like there might be that stigma that exists. And it is from your last book, I sort of gathered that there's no true idea of like a biological normal. We exist sort of as a group, and like we all have different things to offer. And so you mentioned autism and ADHD, and given the right context, you can extract a lot of value and from these modalities of thinking, if you will, because they're sort of different than maybe the way that people conceptualize the world on average. What about behaviors that are sort of it's less obvious to see the advantage of them? Let's say something like schizophrenia.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so it's thought that it's something in the region of schizophrenia is diagnosed in around 1% of the population. So 1 in 100 people have got schizophrenia, and that's across the world and across many, many different decades as well. So historically, schizophrenia seems to have persisted across the human population. Now, what people might not be aware of, and I was quite surprised when I found out, is that 17% of the population, the human population, admit to having experienced some kind of hallucination. So hearing or seeing things that aren't there. So that's a perceptual issue that's also seen in schizophrenia. Right. So it's actually very common, and that's without, drugs or alcohol being involved. So that's just the general population experiencing these types of hallucinations that people with schizophrenia might also experience. When we look at the genes involved, the genetic changes involved in schizophrenia, again, it's got high heritability of around, it's estimated to be around 80%, 90%, slightly lower than 90%, so slightly less than autism. And it's again genes that are involved in laying down the wiring of the neural circuit of the baby in the womb, and are also involved in how that neural circuit is going to function and operate throughout life. When we also look at the genes that are involved, quite a lot of those genes have also been implicated in, quite a lot of people with schizophrenia, their relatives have a high creativity and a high innovation kind of behavioral characteristic. So there's some ideas that this condition, which is quite stable throughout our population, and has a high heritability, the genetic changes that are associated with it confer an advantage up to a threshold, up to a point. And that advantage is creativity and innovation. But once those genes converge, and it's like over 100 genes have been involved that we've identified so far. But once those genes converge, it can reach a threshold, which can then, instead of conferring an advantage, actually confer a disadvantage to individuals. But possibly, as we find out more and more about schizophrenia, possibly in the future, we might start to see that there's like recruitment strategies where we're actually actively trying to attract individuals that have a diagnosis because they think in a particular way as a result of the genes that they've been given.
So there is an advantage to that perceptual modality up to a limit, that being creativity.
With schizophrenia, it's slightly less clear. The data isn't completely there yet. So there's no general scientific consensus that says that people with schizophrenia in itself, people that have been diagnosed with schizophrenia, are more creative and innovative, but you can see consistently that relatives are. So there seems to be some kind of genetic reason behind it that's conferring some advantage, but it reaches a threshold. But perhaps there are some advantages to schizophrenia as well that the data isn't there yet. But perhaps in the future, we might similarly view these very complex conditions in the similar way to how we now currently view autism or ADHD.
So you use the example of the workplace to sort of highlight the advantages of multiple modalities of thinking and different genetic predispositions. Are there other contexts that we should, as like a collective, sort of consider this genetic diversity, that we should try and invoke people from different areas to sort of enhance and make better?
Yeah. So I also look at so friendship groups that we were talking about earlier a little bit, but also I talk about the family being the cradle for intelligence and how collective intelligence actually emerges from the family unit, and it's useful to have multi-generational family members kind of working as a group. Because when you look at the neurobiology of what happens within the brain during the typical lifespan, you can see that different ages are associated with different brain strengths and different ways of operating. So, for example, the younger people are, generally speaking, the more innovative and better they are at lateral problem-solving skills. As we get older, we experience more and we accrue more wisdom from the world, generally speaking, hopefully we do. But we also start to filter out information from the outside world and instead rely more on our stored information, so our prior assumptions about the world, which is why sometimes, much older people can come across as being quite rigid in their thinking, stubborn maybe.
Fair.
It's because their brain is literally weighing information in a very different way to younger brains. So there's different ways of seeing the world and there's different ways of having brain strengths. And when you bring a family together, actually you can see that those brain strengths that are on offer across different generations can come together to create a really successful group sometimes. Or sometimes there's lots of arguments.
I think that's interesting because as you're suggesting, sort of the nature of the brain and the way we process information changes over the lifespan. So is it such that as a young child, it would be good to be around someone with more crystallized intelligence because they sort of make up for what you're lacking? Is that what you're sort of saying?
Yeah, exactly. So there's some lovely studies that have shown, for example, when a grandmother sees her grandchild, her brain region will light up with joy and empathy much more than if she saw her own child. So it gives a generation. So she's got this reward that's intrinsic within her to spend time with her grandchild. And the grandchild benefits from the crystallized knowledge and the wisdom that the grandparent can offer. Now, that particular study was just looking at grandmothers, but there's been a recent study looking at the grandfather's involvement. So there's a culture within China where grandfathers actually play a much more active role. And when they do play a much more active role in their grandchild's life, then actually the success of that grandchild increases remarkably.
Oh, so what is the grandparent, so the grandfather in that case, offering to the child that they wouldn't get elsewhere?
Companionship, wisdom, knowledge.
I see.
Yeah, and that relationship across the generations, that care and that support and that wisdom that the grandparent is offering can actually benefit the younger brain through the wisdom and the support that it's providing, but also primed into that grandparent's brain through this, when we have a look at how the brain lights up with empathy and emotional understanding, is this requirement, this kind of need to kind of link with the younger generation. And then when we look at the grandparents, actually, the more actively they seem to be involved in their grandchildren's life, there's increases in their well-being and their health.
Wow. So there's preferential outcomes for those children who have that exposure.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And it seems that the grandparents that are getting involved also do better. Well, it might be, there is a caveat to this. It might be that those grandparents that are too ill to actually actively contribute to their grandchildren's lives, obviously there's an underlying health issue. Fair. Yeah. So there might be so there's some confounding factors there, but
I can see that making a lot of sense. We've evolved living sort of in multi-generational sort of environments. I think the family unit as it's described in like the modern times, where it's just like your nuclear family is like rather a new idea. We used to live sort of like with grandparents and cousins and in like large tribes and stuff. So that makes sense to me. And it
doesn't have to be though just your, families come in all different sizes and shapes nowadays, don't they? It doesn't have to be just your genetic relations. There's other people within your community that can take on those roles, and that can be very beneficial when you have those relationships across generations.